This is Steve Wilson from the Illinois State Water Survey, and today we're here to do a webinar on Is My Water Safe to Drink? Common Questions About Private Wells. This program is ran through the State Water Survey at the University of Illinois, and the private well class is the program we work under here, and it's funded by RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and US EPA. RCAP is our lead partner in all of these things. They make the work we do possible, and so I certainly want to mention those and thank them for all they've done to help create this effort that we're able to put together. So we're going to get started. So the way this will work today, a lot of you asked questions when you registered, and we'll get to those. We've got about 20 or 30 slides of material that we'll present on common things about wells and sampling, and then we'll get to a lot of the questions you all asked. And as we move forward then, if you have questions during the webinar, I'm probably getting ahead of myself here. Let me move my slide up. As we move forward, there's an opportunity on your GoToWebinar screen to ask additional questions through the chat box or the question box, whichever you happen to have. So a couple things for housekeeping. This program, especially this webinar, is really focused on private well owners. But if you are a sanitarian or environmental health professional and you're looking you're taking this partly for CEU credit for your certification, I just want to make sure everyone's clear that we have offered this webinar 3 times previously this year in January, April, and August. And the same core content can't be used more than once for CEU credit. So if you attended one of those other webinars and you're still in the same certification cycle or credentialing cycle, you can't get credit for this again. So there is a CE attendee form on your GoToWebinar screen down at the bottom where it says handouts, the CE attendance form that you can download if you do want credit for that. And Katie Buckley, who's with us today, can also provide a certificate of attendance for anyone else that might want that for their own state or their own department or that sort of thing. So moving on, today's webinar again is part of a national program that's being implemented through the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, RCAP. They're a technical assistance and training provider that typically is supported by USDA, HUD, EPA, some other groups, mostly federal organizations, to support small and rural systems. And so they do a lot of work with rural housing and with rural water and wastewater community supplies. And then also this private well work, they have staff all around the country who work with well owners on the ground one-on-one. So this program is entirely free because of it's federally funded. And we have developed a 10-lesson course, which I'll talk about later. It's called the Private Well Class, and you can get to that at privatewellclass.org. That's hopefully how you found this webinar. And we certainly recommend, if you haven't taken the class, it's also free, and you can sign up on our website, or if you need help, you let us know, and we can get you signed up. And it sends you, it's 10 lessons that cover what it means to be a well owner and some of the common issues you might have, and why it's important that you understand your well. So we are recording this, and yeah, and I'm going to make sure that they changed the feature on this, and now it has an auto record, and I want to make sure it's doing the right thing here. And at the end, as I mentioned, if you have questions, you can ask them in the question or chat box on your GoToWebinar screen, and Katie's going to watch that during the presentation today. And she's going to put those all in a Google Doc, and I'll share a screen at the end, and we can go through those. So today we certainly have received a lot of questions, and we tried to answer as many of those as we could beforehand. But our team today is myself and Katie Buckley from the Water Survey, who's an outreach specialist and works on the private well class, and also Dan Webb, who manages our public service lab at the State Water Survey. And so Dan has a lot of experience. He's also a well owner himself, and our public service lab in Illinois provides water sampling for private well owners. And until 2011, I believe, or maybe a little sooner than that, it used to be free for any well owner in Illinois to get a water sample for inorganics and metals. So our lab has a ton of experience. We've got samples going back nearly 100 years, and that helps us, helps me as a groundwater hydrologist when we're trying to solve some kind of issue or look at why there's naturally occurring contaminants and some of those sorts of things that happen in Illinois. So, yeah, when we get to that part of the question and answer part, Dan will be answering any of the water quality related questions and most of the treatment ones as well. That's where his expertise is. Okay, so yeah, Dan?
Yeah, I just want thanks.
Oh, no problem. Things to remember as a private well owner, private wells aren't regulated versus a community water supply that is. So, you know, the water, I go into the third bullet here, I pay $40 or $50 a month to my community water supply for water that comes to my house. It comes out my tap. I know it's safe. They've tested it. They maintain the infrastructure to pipe it to my house, and they have staff who make sure that, you know, the treatment that they do to either make the water soft or to remove anything that might be a contaminant and to make sure there's no bacteria is all paid for by my $40 or $50 along with the other, you know, 60,000 homes or so that are in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. As a well owner, that's all your responsibility, and it means you need to understand how your system works, what kind of well you have, how deep it is, all those sorts of things, and also you need to test it regularly like a community does to ensure that it's safe. So, because the thing about well water, the second bullet here, is that it can be the best tasting and safest in the world, but some contaminants are odorless, colorless, and tasteless. I know I grew up on a small farm in central Illinois with an old dug well that my dad swore was the best water in the world because it didn't have chemicals in it like city water does, not understanding that our well was susceptible to surface contamination, and so we likely had bacteria in our well most of the time. So, you know, it's all about perception and understanding and being educated about what it means to be a well owner. Like I said, so it's about being aware. You should understand your well log. If you don't have one, you should contact the driller if you can, or the state or the county or your local health district if they might have one, to understand the differences. And we're not going to talk about these today, but there's a big difference between a sand and gravel well and a bedrock well and a dug or bored well. And you need to understand which one you have, what it means to have a bedrock well that's 200 feet deep versus what it means to have a sand and gravel well that's 200 feet deep. They could be very different in how susceptible they are to contamination. Not only are there surface contaminants that can get into your well if your well's not protected and properly constructed, but there are naturally occurring contaminants like arsenic or some other things that, you know, we have that here in many states. There's arsenic issues where there's naturally occurring arsenic. You can't do anything about it. There's no way to put a well in at a certain depth that's going to minimize that. In most cases, it's just there. It's part of the Earth's crust. It's a natural element in the Earth's crust. And so our goal here is to help you understand where those things might occur, who to ask, so you can find out if that's a consideration for where you live. The one thing about private wells, there's 18 million of them around the country, but almost every one is a unique situation. So specifically with some of the questions we got today, there's really no way to answer your question in general for everyone because it really depends on your specific situation. And so I mentioned that here in a couple of the answers we get. And most importantly, I think it's to learn to ask the right questions. Some people are intimidated because they may not understand their well that well, or they may not be sure who to ask. And our goal is to help you understand that, you know, a lot of these folks that are available, you may have never even considered contacting, like a state geological survey or a USGS office in your state, where those folks would be more than willing to help you understand the geology and the well type and water quality issues that might be related to natural groundwater. So you need to be willing to just, you know, ask those questions and find out who you might go to. And lastly, how important it is to sample your well. It's estimated that 2/3 of people in the that have private wells in the country have never tested their well. And even though groundwater, and there's a perception that all groundwater is, quote, safe, that's not necessarily the case. In many instances, it is. There's no treatment needed. There's no anything. But unless you sample, you really don't know. And you need to know. That's the bottom line to protect your family and your health. So we're going to talk about testing a lot today because that is probably one of the most common questions we get. It's intimidating there too. How to collect it, who do I go to, how often, what do I test for, what do I do when I find certain results, all those things. It's not a simple process per se, but hopefully we can, shed some light on some of these things. So these are some of the questions we get quite typically, and so we're going to kind of go through that. So where do you collect the sample? So what our lab does and what Dan does is ask people when they call and say, we'd like to get a water sample, ask them about their situation, where they live, all that stuff. We house the well logs for the state of Illinois here at the Water Survey. So we can find your well log if you're in Illinois and you call Dan's lab and want a sample. And for Dan's sake, they're trying to find and match up a well log to the well owner. It helps us understand what the water quality results might mean. Knowing if it's a bedrock well or a sand and gravel well or an old dug well makes a difference. But we also ask about if you have any kind of treatment. And that's why up here at the top it says water coming out of your kitchen sink could be chemically different from the water in an outside tap. That's because you may have a softener, a filter, an RO unit, a number of GAC filter on your kitchen sink, granular activated carbon. All of those things change the water chemistry. And so that's not necessarily the water that came out of your well that was in the ground. Now it's been altered. And so sometimes we want to know those differences. And what Dan does is when people have treatment, he asks them to collect 2 samples. One from an outside tap, that's before any kind of treatment, and one from your kitchen sink, which is your drinking water, that is more, it's what you're drinking. And that helps me as a groundwater hydrologist and a researcher to understand, one, the outside tap gives me information on what the groundwater quality is, and then the kitchen tap is more of the drinking water quality, and they can, like I said, they can be different. So we ask questions about, if it's lead pipes, if your housing's before 1986, and all those things, because they make a difference and might be important whenever the analysis is done and you're looking at your results. So the one thing I can say here is that a good lab will provide detailed instructions and be able to answer your questions, and that's kind of a theme. We actually work with the Association of Public Health Labs, and we're trying to educate labs more about they sometimes feel like the well owner should know what they want to do and what they should be asking for. Many times well owners aren't sure and need someone who's a professional to help them understand, here's what you probably should be testing for. We think a lab should be able to provide that service. And so we're working with them to try to educate labs on how they can better serve their clients, which is you, the well owner. And what to test for, really every situation is different, and I'll go through some examples of that in a minute. But it depends on how deep your well is, whether it's a bedrock or sand and gravel well. If you have any known contaminants, the best place to go is your county or local health department. If you, for instance, Tazewell County, Illinois has, part of the county has areas with high arsenic. So if you call the health department there and ask their environmental health specialists, what should I test for? One of the things they're going to tell you is be sure you test for arsenic. It doesn't always occur, but it certainly can, and it can be pretty high in some areas. So, talk to other folks, cooperative extension, a well driller, your neighbors, anything they may have heard of. And whoever maintains the well logs in your jurisdiction or in your state or area, they may have some advice for you too. And in Illinois, that would be the Water Survey and Geological Survey can both help, as well as our State Department of Public Health. So the bottom line is, as a well owner, 99% of the country, a health department or especially a geosurvey or water survey, they can't tell you can't drink your water, even if it is contaminated. But they want to help you understand the health risks if it is. So you should lean on those folks and contact them, and they can help you understand what you might want to test for. And then lastly here, sample for coliform and nitrate annually. So they indicate a pathway to into your well. So itself, coliform bacteria or nitrate, unless it's high, and it's, I mean, there's a little research that suggests it may cause some things, but the biggest concern with nitrate is blue baby syndrome. And so pregnant mothers and babies under 2 shouldn't drink water with high nitrate because your body can't break it down properly, and it causes problems with the blood, your blood, and oxygen in your blood. But the reason we sample for these 2 things is because they're pretty ubiquitous or pretty common on the surface or near the surface because of livestock and septic and all those things. So if you have those in your well at any level, like nitrate above a background, it likely means that there's a pathway into your well. So they're considered indicator constituents. Coliform itself doesn't make you sick. It's E. coli that makes you sick. But coliform is just something that's, you know, like I said, it's very common on the surface of the ground and the earth. And so if you have that in your well, it means that there's likely a pathway into your well, which means your well is not necessarily safe. And I know we get to that in one of the questions that we got today too. So as an example, you can look online, and you may have, depending on where you live, there may be information that's beneficial to you about what you might want to test for. So this is Rhode Island, which, you know, is only about 30 miles across, I believe. So a very small state. We've blown it up here. But all the little dots are where there used to be apple orchards or some kind of orchard, which back in the day, you know, before the 1980s or 70s, you know, back in the 30s and stuff like that, and before, arsenic was heavily used as a pesticide for orchards. So most of these areas have been identified by the state because especially the soil in these areas is heavily contaminated with arsenic. And as that infiltrates into the ground or gets leached, you know, it can reach an aquifer and cause a problem. So they've put this list together, this map together, and as a way of saying if you live in one of these areas or near where you know there's an old orchard, you might be concerned with arsenic. Now the splotch that's in the middle third of the state there, the reason I use this example is because that indicates high beryllium, which, and I say this every time I show this slide, until I found this on Rhode Island's website, I had no idea that beryllium was a regulated contaminant. It's not an issue in Illinois, nor have I heard of it being an issue anywhere before, but it is. If you look up on the EPA's website for the primary drinking water contaminants that a community has to test for, beryllium's listed because it does cause health effects, detrimental health effects. So they've listed that here, and if you're in that area of Rhode Island, then you'd want to test for beryllium as well, which I don't think is a common thing that people test for. So there's information available. As other examples, Massachusetts has this website. Their bedrock has a lot of arsenic and uranium, and so you can type in your email address, and they've created this online system that basically tells you yes or no, you should consider testing for arsenic and uranium based on your location, because they've done enough sampling as a state agency that they understand where it exists and where it doesn't, and it isn't necessarily everywhere. So that's really useful as a resident to know what might be available. And then further, and more of these kind of sites are becoming available. This is Wisconsin's agency that regulates wells and their community water supplies is the Department of Natural Resources. And so they worked with University of Stevens Point to develop this interactive GIS map. I went into the site and I clicked on display arsenic by county. And so what it does, it shows all the private well samples that they've taken and have data for. And you can see a few of the counties are clear, and that's because there's no data in those counties. But the arsenic standard is 10 for a community water supply. So that's what EPA considers as a maximum safe level for people to drink, you know, every day for their lifetime in order not to have a higher risk of certain health effects from arsenic. So you can see from this map that in some counties, there's arsenic samples that are over 20, the 3 that are by Green Bay there. In those areas, then if I lived there or if I was considering buying a house there, I would certainly have it tested for arsenic before I purchased a home or maybe it even has arsenic treatment already installed, and that's very common because, as I said, arsenic's fairly common around the country. So it's just something you can treat for it, and you can take care of it and get it out of your water. It's just you have to know it's there first, and that goes back to the 67% of people who've never tested their well. So what we recommend just in general, and again, we run a national program, so there's specific things in your local or state area that we may not recognize here, like beryllium. So what we tell people in general is you should sample every year for coliform and nitrate. They indicate a pathway to your well. So a lot of things can happen. If you have a PVC a well, you could hit it with a mower, or somebody could back over something, or we've had things like even where people put trees in near a PVC well, and then all of a sudden they start getting bacteria hits all the time, and it turns out that a root had made its way around the annulus of the well, and as that root grew, it cracked the casing. And so now bugs can get into that well, which you'd never know unless you were sampling. So that's why you sample annually, because if all of a sudden you find something, maybe you haven't had it for the last 5 years, and all of a sudden you do, there has to be a reason why. And that's really the same reason for sampling for all the rest of these things. Initially, in every 3 to 5 years, sample for this range of constituents. They kind of give you a fingerprint, if you will, of your water quality. And groundwater typically doesn't change that much. It changes slowly, the water quality does, in a typical aquifer, unless it's shallow and subject to surface infiltration. It will stay very similar. I've got a monitoring well that's in Tazewell County I mentioned earlier, where there's a lot of arsenic. Well, we have 2 wells out of the 30 or so we have over there where the arsenic's always low. And they've been in for almost 30 years, and I can guarantee you every time we sample, there's one well that always is around 3 ppb of arsenic, even though some of the other wells are always around 40 or 45 or some other level, but they're always consistent. And that's because it's a deeper sand and gravel aquifer, so it doesn't change that quickly. A lot of the chemistry is based on the geology and the geologic makeup of the aquifer. So if something changes, like your pH changes or your TDS or turbidity change dramatically from one sample to the next over 5 years, then probably something's happened to your well, or there's some kind of breach or a leak. Something's changed that chemistry. It shouldn't. We've even seen things like in southern Illinois, we had a well that not only did the water quality change, but so did the water level after a small earthquake down in Missouri. And it turned out that's a bedrock well, and because of the shifting of the bedrock, it connected 2 water sources that hadn't been connected before. It actually raised the water level 3 feet and changed the chemistry. So you just never know is the bottom line, and to be safe, it's best to test. And then lastly, as I said, I would never tell anybody to sample for beryllium. It's just not that common. But if you contact your local or state health department in Rhode Island, they're going to say, yeah, if you live in this county, you definitely need to sample for beryllium. So it's always good to call and get advice. And like I said, those folks are there to help you, and so you should lean on them. Ask them questions. There is no, as they say, there's no dumb question, and they want you to learn about your well and be a better steward and make sure you're protecting public health. That's their mission. So so you should call them. So as an example of what having water sample data will do, I'm going to use this example we use all the time. This is a sample from here in Illinois, and what's interesting here is we have a sample that's before any kind of treatment. We have a second sample that's after a softener and a filter, and then a third sample that's after a softener, filter, and the RO unit that was installed in 2015. So this is the raw water chemistry of this well. What's interesting here is the sodium's at 25.9, the pH is 8.02. You can see the turbidity and the color on the right side are 29.8 and 48.1, and down near the bottom on the right, the hardness is 351. That's very typical groundwater in Illinois and around the country. That's usually hard water. It's got iron in it, a lot of those constituents. So taking a sample before treatment that's what the groundwater looks like. Taking a sample after treatment, so after the filter and the softener, so it's a salt softener, right? Most water softeners are using salt. So look at the sodium level. It went from 20 something to 198, and that's not something you'd normally be concerned or worry about. But if you happen to be on a low sodium diet, now you may not realize that you need a lot more sodium in your diet from your tap water than you realized. So the turbidity and color all went down. The hardness went down from 351 to less than 1. And so, his softener is doing its job, and filters taking out any particulates, all those sorts of things. But then he also added an RO unit and reverse osmosis. And one thing I didn't mention here is all the less than arrows mean it's below detection limit. And so, with the RO especially, I'll go back a slide. There's some things that are below detection because they're typically just not that common, or our detection limits may be kind of high for a few of these things. But then with the RO unit, almost everything's less than detection. And it took out all that sodium as well. So an RO unit really does do a good job of taking out a lot of the mineralogy and constituents in water. But by taking out all those things that buffer the water and help maintain the pH, now the pH is dropped to 6.23, which means it's slightly acidic. So an unintended consequence, if you will, of your treatment. And so I know one of the questions we got today was from someone who put in a whole house UV system. If someone put in a whole house RO unit, then you'd have slightly acidic water going through your pipes instead of water that was at 8, which is not acidic, and that could have some corrosive issues. Not so much in Illinois, as Dan will tell you from our lab. Most of our groundwater in Illinois is at 7.5 or above, and so we don't have any of those lower pH waters in Illinois, but there certainly are in other parts of the country. So an RO unit may affect the pH even more in those cases. So that was just an example of that. So when to test your well? Well, in addition to what we've already mentioned, anytime your well's been opened, if there's been any kind of emergency response event, especially a flood or a fire, this is a picture. You can see that well cap laying on the ground. That is an aluminum well cap that got melted because of a forest fire in Colorado. And I don't remember the county gave us a bunch of pictures from a forest fire out there a few years ago and what it did to the wells. And you can see that big glob of black whatever that looks like crinkled up electrical tape. That's actually what's left of all the electrical lines for the motor or for the pump and everything else after they melted together. So we have a short video on our videos page about what to do after a fire, but one of the suggestions is if you know a forest fire is coming, you should turn off the power to your pump, because when you start melting these wires, it could cause your pump just to, forcibly be on, and it'll either run until it burns up or it'll keep trying to pump and cause other problems with your system. So anytime anything happens, I know there was a question about someone who lives in a low-lying area, and they typically have flooding events where they may have the water 2 to 6 feet over their well. You need to sample your well and disinfect every time that happens, because this top of this well is supposed to be sealed properly with a gasket. And if I ask everyone, I could see your hands, how many people have changed the gasket on their well in the last 5 years? I don't think anyone would be raising their hand, and especially if you're in areas where the temperature can vary a lot in cold weather and freezing, those gaskets get brittle and they stop performing the function they're meant for, which is to be a complete seal for your casing, and flood water is going to get into your well. So where do I get it analyzed? What we recommend, the best place is to use a state accredited lab. So because communities have to test their water under the Safe Drinking Water Act to make sure it's safe, every state agency that regulates community drinking water has a list of labs that they've accredited to make sure that they do a good job and that sort of thing. And for everyone around the country, we would recommend you certainly probably need to use an accredited lab if you can. They can be a little more expensive, but you've got some assurance because they've went through testing with the state that they know what they're doing and they're using the right methods and all that sort of thing. So the caveat to that is there are a number of labs at universities around the country that may not be accredited anymore because the rules to be accredited are so costly. Dan's lab is one of those labs. So here at the Water Survey, we use all the EPA methods, we follow the right protocols, but we're not accredited. We were at one time, and about 10 years ago or so, they changed the rules and made it much more difficult and to maintain all the paperwork and have a QA person, and so we're not anymore. Other examples of that are Texas A&M, Virginia Tech, I think Penn State, and there may be a few others. And so if you're in one of those areas, you know, I personally am confident in the work that our lab does. We use them for a lot of work all the time. And anyway, but in general, you should use a state accredited lab, and you can find that list on the state agency's website. Also on US EPA's website, there's a list of all 50 states where you can click on the state you live in, and it'll take you to the web page for the state where they have those labs listed, and you can get information there. More importantly, whatever lab you use, they should be able to give you detailed instructions on how to sample. In some cases, they may come out and collect the sample themselves, how to store it if it needs to be, if it's going to be shipped, and how quick it needs to be in. You know, for compliance sampling, which is the legal requirement for the Safe Drinking Water Act, a community water supply has to submit samples for some things within 24 hours, and they have to be kept on ice. And in some cases, they may use a preservative like acid. Now, for a private well situation, I'm sure they're not going to ship you a bottle that has a little bit of acid in it, so you shouldn't have to worry about that. But then, as you talk to the lab, ask questions until you're satisfied. As I said, they should be able to help you and walk you through the process and make you feel comfortable about what you're doing. And if they can't, they don't have a clue, they don't seem to be helpful, I'd find another lab. Even if it costs a little more, you know, you're talking about your health, it's worth understanding. And a lot of labs do have staff that, you know, can provide that sort of service to you. So that's what we would recommend you use. And lastly here, the lab should provide everything you need. Instructions, even sometimes a cooler or a package to mail them back in where you can put ice or, you know, a pouch thing that you can freeze and stick in there whenever you do the sampling. Or, you know, maybe they even have pickups. I know Virginia Tech's lab does that. They have a service that goes around once a week on Wednesdays and drives around the state. And so if you want a sample, they'll send you a kit, or you can go to a workshop where you get a kit from them, and then they want you to sample the first thing on Wednesday morning and then take it to this location that's like at a library or a post office where one of their folks is going to come around and spend the whole day picking up bottles so that they don't set. And when you know that when the sampling's done and the analysis is done, it's done properly. So as far as interpreting results, there are web pages out there that can help you and a lot of documents online, but there's also a lot of stuff on the web that's very biased and, you know, go in a certain direction. And so you can use those websites, and I'm actually going to show you one that isn't biased, and it's done by a state agency, and it's actually really helpful. But in the end, what we recommend is, you know, your sample analysis is really a description of the water you're drinking that affects your health. And so you should really go to your local health department and take your sample results and ask them to interpret it for you. And if they can't do that, then, you know, you can find a state lab or some other source where an environmental health professional, that's their job, can give you a qualified answer. So, and sometimes when you find something in your well, and I put this here, but it's always good to resample. People can make mistakes, especially if it's a bacteria sample, and that goes to whether they do a colony count or whether it's just presence or absence. But sometimes it could be something you've done in the sampling, and so in some cases it might warrant just taking another sample to be sure. Or if something's really off the charts, it's possible the lab made an error. I mean, I'm sure Dan can attest that, you know, sometimes when they're diluting samples or doing things, maybe someone slipped a zero or did something like that, and you have this sample that it looks like it's really bad, and I'd resample to confirm. So if you do find coliform, then I do an E. coli test, and before you drink that water, you should you should boil your water until you can disinfect your well. I said chlorinate here, but it should say disinfect. I guess that's typically how that's done. And once you've chlorinated your well, test it again. And if it's still not clean, you can try doing that a couple times, and I'll get into that later, show some examples. But you don't want to drink water with E. coli in it. That's the bottom line. So this is the tool I mentioned. And so the state of New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services developed this Be Well Informed guide. And it's really a tool. You can see down here at the bottom, the green box, enter your well water test results. So they worked with CDC to develop this, or CDC funded it, I think. And, this is meant for residents of New Hampshire, but it actually works for anyone. And so we recommend this. I know there's a number of other states that are looking at this tool. New Hampshire's been really great about sharing the code that was used to develop this. And so your state soon may end up having something very similar with guidance that's based for your area, which is the one difference here. So New Hampshire has a lot of arsenic. That's one of the big things they have in that area. And so there's resources that they put together for their residents. You may live in an area where there's no arsenic issue, but there might be some other issue. And so if your state develops a similar type of help site like this, it's certainly worth using to get an idea of what's going on before you go to an EHP, an environmental health professional, to get a qualified answer for your results. So the way this works, you click on the green box on the last slide, and it brings you this page. Be sure and read everything, because there are some disclaimers in here, and it explains what some of the terms mean. And you I typed in 15 micrograms per liter of arsenic. So there's a drop down for the units, micrograms, milligrams, parts per million, parts per billion. What we found from our class, we have a pretest for our private well class that people can take. And there's one question on there that tries to ask people to convert units from micrograms per liter to parts per million. And out of the 3,000 or 4,000 people that have answered that question, less than a third got it right. And so units are really a sticking point, and some of the previous iterations of sites like this usually only had parts per million or milligrams per liter and expected you to be able to convert them. And so there's a lot of issues there. But I don't know of any lab that doesn't report arsenic in one of those 4 units. And so this allows you to make sure you're putting the right thing in. And I stress that just because it's a really big issue. If you put 15 milligrams per liter, that's 1,500 times, or that's 1,000 times the level that you should be putting in there, and it's going to raise a lot of red flags. So we could have put in all the other things here that they have. So they've got a lot of lists of things you can, from your sample results, you can put in here, and it will give you a qualified answer based on that. But I just did arsenic just to show you, and so then I hit submit. It comes back and says that I've got the red X, which means the value entered exceeds the drinking water limit. 15, it should be 0.01 milligrams per liter, which they've converted it there for me. I put in 15 micrograms per liter. It converted it to 0.015 milligrams per liter. And so that's, then what's also nice is below here, then it tells you what kind of treatment works for arsenic. And this actually, I didn't include it on the slide, but it also asked if I had any iron and some other values that I could enter, because those things might affect which kind of treatment might work better. And so I didn't put any of that stuff in, but when you put in your entire suite of sample analysis, if you've done that, then it may give you a better tailored answer. And so there's information, you can click on any of these boxes on what point of use for absorptive media versus point of use for RO. Arsenic exists in 2 forms in the environment, +3 and +5, and one may work better than the other depending on what form the arsenic's in your particular situation. And speciating arsenic's not an easy thing, but it may be you put an RO unit and it doesn't work real well and you still have arsenic, and that might be because it's in the wrong form for the RO unit to work well and to get it out. So, or it may mean you have to do something beforehand, like somehow oxidize the water beforehand in order for the treatment to be more effective. But that's for a treatment person to help you with and someone who understands that really well. So as we go down the page, what's this mean? What my treatment options are. And they mentioned down here under treatment options, number one, NSF ANSI Standard 53 and then ANSI Standard 58. So a lot of treatment equipment is tested by, it has an NSF ANSI standard, and that's, everyone's agreed in the industry that they will test their equipment against a set of conditions, and then an independent third party tests that equipment to see how well it actually does at removing what it's supposed to remove. So if it's been approved, if it's a point of use system for absorptive media and it's been tested against ANSI Standard 53, then you have some assurance that it's going to remove what it's supposed to remove, versus a non-certified treatment equipment that you might find on the web that says it removes it, but there's no proof and they don't have that seal on there that shows that it actually works. And what we've seen, and if you take our class, the 10th lesson is all about treatment issues, and there's a lot of issues related to treatment. You know, vendors who sell equipment that might not be as good as some others, things like that. Excuse me. And what we recommend is if you have to have treatment, that you should always use something that's been certified. And what we see is that in a lot of cases, the uncertified treatment devices might be a half or a third of the cost of the certified ones, but in the end, you get what you pay for, is the bottom line. Okay. So again, I want to mention this one more time. These tools are great, but they should only be used as a guide, and they're for typical water. We certainly find areas where water is atypical. There's an area in northern Illinois where the pH is almost 12, which is, you know, kind of crazy when you think about it. It really shouldn't be, but it's an area that's just what's happened for a number of reasons. So always take your results to the health department and get a qualified answer. Again, they want to ensure that your water is safe to drink, so they want to help you. And when I said 99%, I know there's several counties that have passed their own ordinances out east on if you get your water tested by their lab, or you're selling a home and it's tested through a program they may have, and you find a contaminant, they can force you to treat and bring it up to the standard, or, you know, reduce the amount of contaminant. But it's, you know, you should check for those rules, because in every place else in the country, there are no required water quality standards for a private well. And it's actually even mentioned in the Safe Drinking Water Act that it only, those rules only apply to community water supplies, not to private wells. So they can recommend you don't drink it. I can, you know, and I would too. We sampled a well that had 250 ppb of arsenic. They have 6 kids, and they're not doing any treatment. We certainly suggested that they talk to their health department about what they might want to add for treatment, but in the end, it's up to them. And you'll certainly run into people who think their water tastes great, no one's ever got sick, and so they're not going to do anything to change it. And you know, that's a personal decision, is all I can say. So a couple other things real quick. Correcting poor construction. So what we found is that, you know, what causes water quality problems in wells typically is that wells don't meet construction code. So until the 60s or later, there were no construction codes anywhere in the country, and so it was done, it might not have always been used the right equipment or the right materials, or it may have not have been drilled deep enough to be safe, or whatever. As construction codes change, existing wells are always grandfathered in. So the well I grew up on was hand dug by my grandpa in 1933. When it rained, we had cloudy water, and it's not safe, and it really shouldn't have been used. But that's how it was done. And what we find is that that's typically the biggest problem. When people have water quality issues, it's really one of two things. It's a natural occurring contaminant like arsenic, that just exists in the aquifer and there's no way to get it out, or it's a well that's too shallow and not properly constructed, so it has surface influence or is influenced by livestock or a septic system. And so there's two problems there, and that is one that is, it's certainly an opportunity for surface contamination, and in cases it can be a safety hazard. So when I say that, it's because in the old days, before the advent of a pitless adapter, which is a piece that fits on your well below the frost line if you're in a climate that freezes, so that, but before that was invented, people put their wells in pits, so they'd be below the frost line and they would not have to worry about their pipes freezing. So there, we still find wells in pits today, and that's a safety hazard. They can flood, they can have poor protection on the surface, and folks can fall in, or tractors can fall in, all those sorts of things. And so here's a couple examples. The picture on the left is an old dug well. It's this corrugated tile, really, and they had a piece of plywood over it, and I'm sure the person who fell to her death, as it says here, walked on top of that piece of plywood dozens or hundreds of times. But this time it broke and she fell in and it killed her. But when you look at this picture a little more closely, you see the funnel sitting there. It looks like old insulation that's laying up against the wall. There's part of a broom over on the upper left. So every time you walk across that, stuff's probably fallen in the well. Rats and mice, anything else can fall in the well. And so it's, it's just not a very safe way or a way to ensure that the water quality is maintained in a well. This looks like it could be in its own little old well house or in a barn. And the picture on the right speaks for itself. That's a goat. It fell in this well. It looks like it's been there a while, and I know that's disgusting, but it really proves a point. There are a lot of these kind of wells out there. And if this well is connected to an aquifer, not only is it contaminating this well, but it can contaminate your neighbor's well. And so there's a real need for people to understand what having a safe, protected well means. And, a lot of folks, it's just always been that way. The same way with the well I grew up on. No amount of explaining to my dad would change his mind about how good the water is in our well. So it's an attitude that is pervasive in rural America, especially, but just in general that, it's coming out of the ground, it's got to be safe. And we've got to do our part to make sure that's true. So what should you do with these wells? Try to bring them up to code. Some cases that, may just mean a new well, which, is expensive, but do what you can to protect the well so that, if it's especially a well in a pit and it's a small diameter well, extend it to the surface, put on a new well cap, fill in the area of clay grout if need be, and then talk to, a contractor or a well authority or a county health department or state about, what should you do to make sure this well's safe. Because it is, like I said, poor construction is 2/3 to, 3/4 of the problem that we find. When we have a well that's contaminated or has some kind of issue, typically you can start looking at the well and around the well and you see why. So the other part of this is abandoned wells. We don't know how many abandoned wells there are out there, but I know what I can tell you about Illinois. The law was passed in 1968 that required a driller to file a log and a permit with a county health department. And so any well drilled before that for sure is undocumented, and we find those all the time. In some states, those rules weren't passed until much later. New York didn't pass a law requiring a log to be filed until 2000, which means the state of New York probably has maybe 10% of the logs for the wells that actually exist and are being used in New York. The state of Mississippi requires a permit for every well, but they only require you to file a log. I believe this is correct, for any well over 5 inches in diameter. So there are entire counties down there where they have no well logs on file because they're all 5-inch wells. And so the drillers aren't required to file a log. So without that information, it just makes it more difficult to understand what the risks are, where there might be contamination potential, because all these wells, you poke a well into an aquifer and you've created a straw, if you will, or conduit from the surface down to the aquifer. And if someone doesn't understand the ramifications of burying a barrel or pouring something down the well directly, or making sure that the well cap is safe and sealed, they can contaminate, and it's also a safety hazard. A lot of times, old dug wells that have been abandoned are found the hard way, and you don't want to be that person or have one on your property. This bottom bullet is really important, because if you have a old dug well on your property that's not sealed, and it's a risk, someone gets hurt or gets killed or an aquifer gets contaminated, you're going to be liable, and you don't want that. No one does. So here's just a couple more examples. The pictures, by the way, are from the Washington State Department of Ecology. They are the state agency in Washington State that regulates drillers and well construction, and so they have this blog. I haven't been on it for a while, but well, they regularly showed pictures of things happening just in Washington. So there's a horse in a well. They're fishing a guy out of a well. He fell 45 feet and he wasn't hurt, which is just amazing. But the newspaper articles on the right, 3 of those are from Illinois. The third one is Jessica McClure from Midland, Texas. If you're old enough to remember, back in the 90s, she fell in a well. She was maybe 3 years old, 18 months old, it says here, I guess. And it was covered on on CNN, I think, for 18 hours while they dug her out, and she ended up being safe and, is a successful adult these days. But the other 3, I point them out because they're all regional papers in Illinois. Galesburg's in western Illinois. Springfield, the State Journal Register, is in the center of the state where our state capital is, and the other one is Buffalo Grove, which is a Chicago suburb. And, these are all from the 90s. So things are different today because of social media and the internet, blah, blah, blah. But I guarantee you that none of the folks who read one of these articles read all 3 and understand how common this was. These all happened in the same year. So, it's a bigger problem than people realize. You just don't necessarily hear about it. But folks die, they fall in these wells, and it's something to take care of if you have one, is the bottom line. So that is all that I have for our canned presentation today. The rest of this time we're going to spend going through the questions that you folks all asked prior to when you registered for the event. So the next 5 or 6 slides are all related to water quality, and Dan has provided answers to most of those, and so I'm going to ask Dan to, and I might have had something to say here. The one about, this first one here about water becomes cloudy and brownish is near and dear to me because I grew up on a well like that. And and it says indication groundwater is getting in there. I think the person wrote the wrong thing down, because I just wanted to mention that, a well, you want groundwater to get in your well. What you don't want is surface water. So, Dan?
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's just what Steve said. You want the groundwater getting in there. Basically, if you see it changing a lot with rainfall, it's an indication that the surface water, it's at least influenced significantly by the surface water, and that's what we're trying to protect against. You want the natural ground to filter out that stuff like it usually does. If you have a situation like that, Steve already described it, his own well when he grew up, but it likely means you've got a problem with your well casing, or that you're set in a area that's shallow enough to be influenced by surface water. So the options there are to fix your problem if you can. If you can't, or if it's in a vulnerable setting, you're probably going to be looking at continuous disinfection, like a chlorinator or UV light.
Here, let me go on. There we go. Sorry.
Oh, no problem at all. Yeah, similar. We had several questions, I think, that had to do with some type of a disinfection, but the next person was asking if, said that they treated their well pipe, and it sounds like they have a storage tank, and they treated both of those with chlorine, and they still had E. coli, and so they've added a UV light. And so what else should they be looking at? Well, one thing to point out here is that sometimes if you do a little maintenance, you might drop a couple of pellets of chlorine down in your well. It doesn't necessarily mean you've disinfected your whole system. You want to make sure that you allow the chlorinated water to flow through all the pipes, not just the holding tank or pressure tank. And also, I've talked to some people before, some health department people, and they've mentioned that sometimes the bacteria can create a layer. So it may take a few chlorination tries to get rid of that slime. Like it'll kill off the surface layer, and then get rid of some of it, and then you have to keep going. If you do that and you feel comfortable that you've done all the right steps for the chlorination, then what I would do is get another test done just to confirm. I think Steve might have mentioned something like this in a previous slide. It's still a good idea. I think we've got another question about a UV light also later, but one thing to consider is when you're taking the sample, follow the instructions carefully. There's a lot of precautions they'll use to make sure you're not accidentally contaminating it. They may ask you to wear gloves, remove the screen, disinfect the end of the faucet, probably with some alcohol, and then let the water run for several minutes. Don't get a stagnant water. If the bottle has preservative in it, don't flush it out, and be careful about how you handle the cap and the bottle. So things like that will prevent a false positive, maybe something that you caused with your hands, and then you can collect a follow-up sample. I think we'll have a wait more on the UV light. I think we've got a follow-up question later, but most sites I'd still sample after the UV light just to give yourself confidence in your results. We do get a lot of questions. The next question is regarding sulfur bacteria or bacteria that contribute to the production of hydrogen sulfide smell. We get that question a lot. These bacteria themselves are not generally considered harmful as they usually exist in people's well water. Hydrogen sulfide is a pretty common problem, and it's usually attributed to these bacteria. At the levels found in groundwater, it's not generally considered a hazard, even though you'll read that hydrogen sulfide gas can be a hazard. People won't drink the water, be unpalatable if it's got to the levels that were going to start to be hazardous. Typically, though, they might treat the water. Some of the treatment might be venting the gas. If you've got like a pit or a basement it's being vented to, you want to make sure it gets vented outside so that it doesn't build up like in your basement. Some other things you might want to be thinking about if you have these bacteria is you could, a solution would be to try to chlorinate it. They may also cause a slime like other bacteria that might cause clogs in your screen or components. Hydrogen sulfide itself has also been listed and associated with causing black stains and corrosion. In some rare instances, it may be tied to pollution. So if you do have any concerns there, I would get a normal sanitary test for the fecal coliform and nitrate. Related to some of the other disinfection questions, the person was asking, how do you know if a well's been flooded? And also after that, if it's been flooded, how much bacteria is considered contamination? Probably similar to like some chemistry results where, hey, maybe you can stand a little bit of bacteria. I'm not a bacteria expert, but if you look at the guidelines, basically the standard is 0, and if it's anything above that, it's considered contamination. If I had a little bit of contamination, like one colony count, if you have a test that provides you the count, there are also presence and absence tests, which we get these questions a lot, and it seems like there's somewhat of a debate about whether people should report these as presence and absence or colony count, and that's something that the private well class is looking into currently. But what I was going to say there is if you did have just a really low count, like just the very minimum, I would be suspicious of just accidental contamination. So I probably would get it retested before I invested a lot of time and effort into installing a further treatment, or, chlorination is pretty easy to do, so you could do that. But anyway, I would just get it retested. As far as how do we know if a private well has been flooded, like is mentioned here, hopefully it's obvious, but if you do have suspicions, it's safe to test it.
Okay, well, sorry about that. Man, I'm struggling today.
Oh, no problem, Steve. Yeah, I was just pausing. I assume that you'll advance it after that. But so another common question, similar to sulfur, is also a common question, but rust is probably even more common. People ask about the rust in water. Is it safe? What are the causes? How can I get rid of it? The rust you see in water is due to iron. There are a few other things that can cause colored water and natural organic matter called tannins, but for most people, they're complaining about rust. And it's not considered harmful. It's a natural product. As minerals are dissolving underground, the iron will dissolve. When it gets pumped up to the surface, though, it can be oxidized from its ferrous state to a ferric state. And this oxidized state is what precipitates out of solution, typically like as iron hydroxide and then later iron oxide. The EPA lists this as a secondary contaminant. It's got a secondary maximum contaminant level. It's pretty low, 0.3 parts per million. So it can cause staining at fairly low levels. The way to get rid of iron, first I would put in a sediment filter if you've got some iron or other sediment that's been collecting in your pressure tank or just pumped up from your well. The sediment filter is really cheap, really easy to put in, really easy to maintain. That'll take care of suspended material. And then you want to get rid of the dissolved stuff, though. So that would either involve an iron filter, which will do some type of oxidation to change that into something that can be filtered out. Or a lot of people will just use a softener. If you get a good quality softener that has a large capacity for iron, and I would think you could talk to your well dealer or your water treatment dealer, and they can give you recommendations for a good softener. I would personally oversize it a little bit. If it's rated for 4, that might be under perfect situations. You might buy a softener that can take out 10 parts per million of iron. If you do have iron bacteria, like evidence of slime maybe in your toilet tanks, you may also want to consider disinfecting, but a lot of people will just have problems with just the rust itself and that'll be their top complaint. So usually a softener is what we see is the most common, but some people will also have an iron filter if they have, especially if they have like over 10 parts per million of iron. Okay, so the next question was about softened water, and is there a guidance for setting the softeners so that the copper or other corrosion is minimized? So I'm taking that the person means, can I soften the water partially, like set it so that it doesn't remove all the scale. Some of the scale forming equations out there, indexes, they do take into account the softness of the water or the hardness of the water when they talk about scale formation, and sometimes people will use those as to predict corrosivity, but corrosion is a complicated process. I don't think you're going to find, there are some equations that will seem to imply that the soft water is more corrosive, but I think generally the EPA's looked at it in some studies. People don't really consider the soft water to be that corrosive or that different than the hard water. But more importantly, the softeners don't typically have a setting like this where you can just set the degree of softening. The water just passes through a resin, and that typically removes all the hardness. You do have a small point if you let the resin go to where it is almost exhausted, then you're going to have some amount where it's partially hard, partially soft, but that's not typically something you're meant to control, and I think it would be difficult to control. If you did want to have a mixed softened hard water, if you didn't want it totally soft, I would think that you could put in some type of a mixing valve, like divert some of the water to a softener, and then remix it along with the hard water later, and then send that out to the house if that was really the goal here. Unless there's I think that's the way you would do something like that if you wanted the mixed water.
Okay.
And the next question was about heterotrophic plate counts and monitoring water quality in a well system. To be honest, I don't really know much about these, so I had asked a colleague to look into some of this, and some of the notes are she's put on here that these tests are non-specific, which meaning they'll include bacteria, yeast, and molds, and a lot of that stuff may not be hazardous. And if you're really interested in fecal coliform or fecal contamination, there are specific tests that are better for that. So I suspect well owners would be more interested in the fecal tests. The heterotrophic plate count tests are used to monitor water treatment processes, and she's provided a link here for more information. So I would advise going to that link. I don't want to act like I know more than I do about the topic, so I think that's the best place to go.
Well, and this would be a good place to point out, you don't have to write all that down. We are recording this, and this webinar will be on our videos page probably in a week, and so you can get that then if you're interested. So, or email us and we can send you the link. I guess I'm going to take this one, I guess.
Okay, yeah, either one of us. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, so we just shock chlorinated our well at a new house 3 times, and after the results, the coliform still wasn't 0, and so they installed the UV system for the whole house. Is it still important to test their well to make sure the bacteria numbers don't go up, and would it still be every year? So basically, the question is, we've had all this treatment, now do we still need to test? But more importantly, how did you chlorinate your well? We hear a lot of different stories from folks about my driller said to do this or my driller said to do that. I just met with a well owner where their driller told them to pour a cup of bleach down their well every month. That's not shock chlorinating, I realize, but there are a number of questions about shock chlorination that were here. I don't think we didn't answer all of them, but there's a really good process that you have to follow. It needs to be mixed at the right concentration so that you can then run chlorinated water through every line in your house, through every spigot, faucet, shower head, toilet, and then you let it sit so that it has time to kill the bacteria that might be in there. And then you flush it through after overnight or 6 hours, as what's recommended, in order to make sure that you've done that. And sometimes you have to do it more than once. As I know Dan's mentioned before, maybe not today, sometimes there can be like a slime buildup or whatever. It might take more than one time to really get rid of that. But I would, there's one thing we do know is there's probably 100 different procedures out there on how to disinfect a well and shock chlorinate it. And one, I would like to know how you guys did that, and if it was done properly, because it really comes down to, if you properly disinfect your well and it was a one-time occurrence and it's not that you have a continuous source, it should get rid of all the bacteria. And if you're in a situation like we mentioned in an earlier question where it's a shallow well or there's a breach in the well, so there's going to be a pathway for bacteria to get in your well all the time, then that means it's vulnerable, and it's always going to require more disinfection. You can't get rid of it. And so the other issue here then is why I would still sample if you're sure your chlorination was done well, and so you just have a vulnerable well or a likely source, I would sample to make sure your UV is always working. If you know that without it you have bacteria, you need to sample to make sure that it's doing its job. I mean, I know Dan had mentioned to me that he asked me a question about how long do UV lights last. We don't have any experience with those really. We just know that it's becoming a bigger market for for private wells, and they've developed treatment with UV that's much more affordable these days. But you need to understand how the maintenance and treatment instructions is the most important thing, and that way you're sure it's still working. But the best way to ensure that it's working is to test your water and to show that it's bacteria free. So anything to add there, Dan?
I'm not sure if you mentioned it or not, or if it came up in a previous part, but yeah, some of the people that will ask me, how long the UV light's good for, also in the conversation often will come up, I think somebody had an alarm or something once. I'm not overly familiar with UV systems, but you do want to make sure that you don't have sediment flowing through them, like rust or other sediment that'll diffuse the light and cause to be less effective than it normally is supposed to be. So in many cases, if you have those types of problems, you're probably going to want some type of a sediment filter or something to get rid of the iron ahead of that so that your UV light works properly.
It's a really good point I forgot to mention. Thank you. Okay, so and this question wasn't asked today, but I pulled it out of a presentation that we did a few months ago because I wanted to highlight this resource. So as I mentioned, it's a bad idea to pour chlorine bleach in your well on a schedule. You should really only disinfect your well when it needs it, and that's determined by sampling that show you have bacteria. So there is no pouring bleach in your well every month, or I just shot chlorinate it twice a year just to make it better. One straight bleach is too concentrated. It can ruin the seals, like on your pitless or your pump, and your other well components. It can start to cause problems. Plus, it's an oxidant, so in some bedrock situations, having real high concentration of chlorine hit your well and have access to the actual rock formation can release metals. And so what we've done is, I mentioned there's literally hundreds of different brochures out there on how to disinfect your well, and we went through a lot of them. And we settled for our class that we have online. We list the one from Minnesota Department of Health, to me is the most useful that exists today on how to disinfect your well properly. So we list that. If you go on our website under Lesson 10, under Resources, you can see it says Lesson 10, Water Treatment Solutions, and then there's a list of about 10 or 12 documents there that you can click on. They're all free, and one of them is linked to this document. And it's the Well and Water System Disinfection for Private Wells from Minnesota Department of Health. And it's really useful because it tells you how to mix it so you have the right concentration, what kind of bleach to use, that you might have to do it more than once. Tells you all the details. It even tells you to turn off your pump while you're when you open up your well. Turn off the power when you need to, and it's really well done. It even has information on what to do with your treatment equipment. One is to go to the Water Quality Association, WQA.org, and see what they list from the manufacturers. They represent all the treatment manufacturers, and they'll have recommendations on what to do when you're going to chlorinate your well, so that you don't damage your treatment equipment, things like that. So I just wanted to share that because I think that is a good resource. And we know from all the folks we work with around the country that there are folks today looking at some of these procedures that are out there and how effective they really are, because there's not a lot of science to back up some of the recommendations that are in a lot of these methods. And so, we're eager to see, it'll probably be a year or two away, but what those university folks come up with related to maybe coming up with a new standard that everyone can use around the country. So, okay, so we had two questions about chemical spraying, and I just lumped them together. What's the possibility that chemicals used in the neighboring farm field will reach my well at 325 feet? And local power company uses a brush-killing chemical on a right-of-way. Is there any danger of it reaching my well? So what I want to say about the application of pesticides today is it's become much more restricted, and the chemicals that are really persistent in the environment have gone away, and any that are sort of persistent or that do have health effects are tagged as restricted use. So They can't just be used anywhere. Like I know there's restricted use agricultural pesticides that can't be used in some counties in Illinois because it's all sandy soil and it's too easy to leach that down into the groundwater. So, but that said, like any other well issue, it really depends on your individual situation. 325 feet seems safe, but we know in New York, for example, I worked there for a little bit, working with the state agency there. Some of the older wells that were before well construction code was required could be 325 feet deep, but they might only have 25 or 30 feet of casing or even less. So then the rest of that well is open bore, open hole in the bedrock. So that means if water can get to 30 feet, it can get in the well. And so being 325 foot total depth doesn't really help you there. And so this, like many other questions we've gotten that are really site specific, we need more details in order to really answer your question. So like the one about the brush killing chemical, you know, how deep's your well? How far away is it? You know, there's just a lot of information. You know, when I work with well owners in Illinois, a lot of times we end up with pictures or we go to the site just to be sure we understand, you know, in general, the water table, which isn't an aquifer, but can serve as a water source for a dug well, follows the landscape. So if the land's sloping away from your right-of-way, if the right-of-way is below your well, then likely water's flowing away from your well. In the shallow sense, that doesn't mean that the aquifer is. It could be flowing in a different direction. So there's just, you know, there's a lot of details. And, you know, if you're really concerned about it, we can probably find an RCAP staff person in your state who might be able to help you answer those questions, or it could come out and do an assessment to look at your well. And if that's the case, then you can contact us and use our when I pull up the questions that are asked today from this Google document that Katie's putting together, I think at the bottom it lists our email address, but it's just info@privatewellclass.org. So, okay. How long do you wait after flooding to test your water? And I can't read all that because of my GoToWebinar screen. Okay, we are in a low-lying marsh area, and hurricanes and water surges have caused 2 to 6 feet over our well at times. I mentioned this earlier. You know, every time your well gets flooded, you have to disinfect it first and then test to make sure that the disinfection took. You should assume anytime your well's flooded, especially overtopped, that it's contaminated, and so you shouldn't drink that water until it's been tested and proven safe. So, you know, I don't have, I should have put a picture here that I use sometimes about flooding, and I didn't think of that, unfortunately. But there's a hog farm here in Illinois that they had to put their well in a floodplain. And instead of just having a regular well that you can walk up to and it's maybe 18 inches over the top of the ground where the well cap is, they actually extended the casing up to 10 feet. And so, and then put the well cap so that if that area floods, they've made sure that they've used a good bentonite seal for the annulus. And there's no way the well could be overtopped. They put the top of the well above the 100-year floodplain. And so putting a well in a marsh area where you're going to have water that overtops your well regularly, the best thing to have done would have been to extend your well casing up to 8 or 10 feet above land surface. You can always use a ladder. Your contractor or a driller can always use a rig as tall. They can get over top of it still, but you shouldn't design a well in the first place that can regularly be overtopped by 2 to 6 feet of water. It's just not a good idea, because as I said, over time, those gaskets and rubber seals that are meant to keep that water tight, they start to break down like any other piece of equipment or any other rubber seal or gasket. So it's not always going to be protective unless you're really diligent about maintaining that and changing those out and things like that, especially if you're talking about salt water, I imagine. So yeah, that's what I would recommend there. Yeah, and as far as waiting, I would say once the floodwater is gone. Otherwise, it's still at risk of being contaminated. And if there's standing water around your well, unless you're 100% sure your annulus is completely sealed properly and there's no way water is going to go down around the well bore, you could still be contaminating the area where your well's getting its water from. Somehow I lost it. Okay. Is there a convenient way to get rid of algae in well water? The only time that we've ever seen algae in a well is when the well is directly influenced by a pond, lake, or river. And so I had someone from New York who has a hunting cabin on a lake up in northern New York contact me. They had a filter that had all this green stuff in it, and they took it to a lab, and it was algae. And so then after I asked a few questions, it was really clear the well's about 15 feet from the lake, and it's bedrock at the surface. And so, the well is actually just pulling surface water from the lake. So I took a quick look at the literature because this has come up more than once now, and there's really no definitive work suggesting it's even possible to have algae in a well if it doesn't have sunlight, let alone evidence of it happening. So my first question is, have you tested to be sure that it's algae and not something else? Because that shouldn't be possible. I did find where there's some unique algae that can, they use sugar or some other source instead of sunlight. Anyway, and I know that's been asked as one of the questions today, so I'll get back to this later. But we should probably talk about this to get more information from you. So there's also a number of questions about specific treatment. Like someone mentioned a specific UV device or a specific RO unit, and we don't get into details about this one's better than that one. We're not representing any company, nor comes back to you should use equipment that's certified by NSF and meets an ANC standard so that you're sure it works, would be what we would recommend. So, but there are many kinds of treatment out there. Many are, and some are specific to a certain contaminant, and others take out a broad range of things like an RO unit does. And so, the best thing to do is test your water, make sure you understand what's in it first, and then educate yourself about those types of treatment that might be beneficial. The Be Well Informed tool that we showed earlier is a good starting point for your sampling results, because they will recommend treatment and treatment types that are known to work for that type of contaminant. Because sometimes one thing I found in the field when I go working with a well owner or go out and we get requests to do assessments of wells and how they might be vulnerable, is sometimes people have all this treatment equipment they're maintaining, and they just wanted to be safe, or they ran into a really slick salesman. And I'm not saying that that happens in every industry. So it's not that you can't trust water treatment device folks. It's just that there's good and bad in every industry, and a few people have bought a lot of equipment they probably didn't need. And so we actually developed materials as part of our lesson 10 on water treatment solutions that kind of gives you some advice, and like we show a table for an NSF and why you need to use those sorts of things. And there's a paper that was put out by Penn State on what to be aware of if someone's trying to sell you treatment equipment. And the general answer there is you should always get a third-party independent opinion. Not if someone comes to your house and they've got some little kit and they test your water and like, oh yeah, this is showing red, that means it's really bad. I would find out what that test really does and talk to like a health department person or someone that you trust to make sure that what's going on there is what you really need. And it's, anyway, I would take her class. If you haven't taken her class, that's the first thing to do. It's free, it's self-paced. It's really just a lot of material that you can read through and learn more about your well, and it provides some good advice there. Okay, does every state or county require the inspection of all well construction prior to being put in service? Well, no. Illinois does. our county health departments have to inspect every new well that's drilled after the permit's been filed, and they inspect to make sure they've done things right and they're grouting things the way they're supposed to. But every state is different. Many states don't have that requirement. There's no rules on private wells. I know in Tennessee they don't have the staff, and it's not a requirement, but their Department of Health on its own has made it a priority. I think they do 1 in every 5 or 1 in every 10, I can't remember, where they'll go out and so they're doing a subset of all the wells that are drilled just to make sure the drillers are doing their job, and so they're keeping them on their toes and all that sort of stuff. But everything's different all over the country. There's actually 2 states, Pennsylvania and Alaska, that don't have well construction code. Anyone can go in and drill a well and use any kind of equipment, any kind of materials, whether it makes it safe or not. There's no law that says you can't do that. And so in the same way, they don't license drillers. And so I know in Pennsylvania, at least, a few of the counties there have taken it upon themselves to require that if you're going to drill in my county, you have to be a master well driller listed through the National Groundwater Association, which NGWA has a program for drillers where they can show that they have the wherewithal and the proper training and follow the proper type of details for construction and equipment and everything else, that they can become a licensed master well driller. And that's really just an NGWA designation that doesn't have any state, quote, legitimacy, but it is meant to be something that recognizes drillers for being on the better half of the scale, and who follow procedures that are, best practices and observant of the environment and all that sort of thing. So this lack of consistency is really a problem around the country, and that's why, we're trying to help well owners become better stewards of their wells themselves. And like I said here, that's why we're working to empower well owners to understand their well and take a buyer beware attitude. There's some areas like in New Jersey where when you sell a home with a well, the state requires that a sample be taken, and the only people that see the results are the buyer and the seller. But it can affect property values, and it can also affect your health. So we tell every well owner, if you're going to buy a house and it's got a well, sample the well first. And, a lot of people have said to me, well, this is a really demanding market. If we don't put a bid on it today and we don't agree within a week, we'll lose it. And I would say lose it. And that's just my own opinion. One of our own staff earlier this year, bought a house just on the edge of our community, and it has a private well. It's an aquifer that's known to have arsenic in it in some cases. So they had a sample taken, and sure enough, the arsenic was, I think, 78 parts per billion in their well. So, they were going to have to add treatment, and it turned out that right across the road, they're putting in a new subdivision, and literally right across this county road. And so they contacted the water purveyor here for Champaign-Urbana, and they ran a line out. This was going to be on city water, the subdivision across the road. So they ended up deciding, rather than dealing with an RO unit, installing treatment, and having to make sure it was maintained and all those things, that they paid $4,000 to have a line run under the road, and so they're on city water. And in all honesty, I think they did the smart thing. They could afford it, but it's just peace of mind, because there's someone who is making sure your water's safe, and you'll always have water pressure. You're not going to have in the middle of the winter your pump go out and not have water and have to have somebody come out and try to fix it. There's just a lot of things about being a well owner that, it isn't for the meek, and you really need to have some wherewithal and understand what your responsibilities are if you're going to be a well owner. And that's kind of what we're trying to impart to everyone through this program. Okay. And I know from growing up, and I went through the ice storm that Illinois had in 1976 when I was a small boy, and we were without power for 7 days. So, a well pump doesn't work without electricity, is the bottom line. Is bentonite clay, not drilling mud. So bentonite, is a natural clay that expands when it gets wet. It's used in some cases as to fill in the area between the well casing and the hole you drilled to put the well in. That's called the annulus. So you might drill an 8-inch hole and put in a 6-inch well. Well, that inch all the way around that's wider than the well is filled with bentonite clay or concrete or some mixture to make sure that things can't run down along the annulus and contaminate your well. So this question is about states require sometimes liquid or cement. I lost the term. That's really crazy. Or liquid grout. And so our own experience in putting in monitoring wells, that's the only wells that I've drilled, are monitoring wells. They're 2-inch PVC wells that we put in so that we can measure water quality or water levels around the state of Illinois. We use bentonite chips, and they seal better, they expand and stay wet, and we've never had problems with any of our wells, and sometimes we're drilling through multiple aquifers to get to the one where we want to put our screen, things like that. So one, I'm going to assume you mean, instead of a sanitary seal, I'm going to assume you mean grout, and that's the area around the outside of the wells I mentioned. A lot of times when we talk about sanitary seals, it's usually a reference to the well cap and how well it seals and how watertight that cap is on a well. But regardless, the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services did a study in 2006 and for several years where they worked with different kinds of grout, cement, liquid grout, and bentonite. And they found that the most consistent sound way to grout a well is with natural bentonite chips. Concrete can shrink when it hardens, and especially if it's dry. So if you put it in an annulus where there's not a natural water level, then that can leave gaps, or it might not seal up against the casing properly. Liquid grout can leave the well bore, which means you put it in the hole around the well, but it can seep out into the formation, the geologic formation. And when that happens, then the grout's not there anymore. And that's what they found in the Nebraska grout study. And so the best advice, especially if you're a sanitarian and who asked this question, I would suggest you Google the Nebraska grout study and educate yourself on what they found. They actually found that natural bentonite chips were the best thing to use. And actually, the National Groundwater Association has a Driller's Magazine. And when this came out, I think in 2006, the headline of the article is about how states are going to change their construction code to require, not using such liquid grout. It's going to have to be thicker. It's going to have to use more material that's not going to have this happen and have it go out in the formation. And no state changed their well code, which is, really surprising. So, so it's an issue. I would say the bottom line as a well owner is even if your well is supposedly properly grouted and meets construction code, if you have a problem, that's one reason why you sample, is it might identify that maybe your grout isn't working like it's supposed to, and there is a pathway down into your well from the annulus and around your well. And that's a reason to make sure you're not doing anything near your well that could cause a problem or that has any kind of contamination potential. And it's also a reason why you should sample annually because that'll identify that's the problem or can help you identify that's the problem. Okay, so these are the last two questions. It's already 2:30. I am talking a lot today. What are the best motivators for getting well owners to test their wells, and how do you have any communication materials to help educate and encourage people to test? I just want to mention that that's part of what we do. We have a 4-hour workshop for sanitarians. That's about 90 minutes on how to do outreach to well owners. We did a research study working with CDC, and we've learned a lot about the best approach and how you can be more successful at getting well owners to test. We're doing that workshop on January 10th, and it's on our webinars page, and it's worth 4 CEUs if you're a sanitarian. We've done this 3 times already, and RCAP staff have actually delivered this workshop in about 30 states around the country. I know they're going to be doing a few more of those in this next year, And so if you'd rather do it in person, it's a little more interactive that way. But as far as, so you can contact us for more information about that. And as far as the communication materials, we've developed a lot of materials along with our class itself through the private well class, and that's just privatewellclass.org. And so the last part here is really going to be a little bit more about our class. So it's a series of 10 lessons, and it's self-paced. You can go on our webpage and sign up, and it sends you an email once a week with a PDF that's, you know, lesson 1 through lesson 10 as you go on, and that's the website URL. So here's the front page, and you just click on Learn by Email over here on the bottom left, and it takes you to a page where you can sign up. We also have podcasts and videos, but if you click on Learn by Email, it just asks for your email address, your first name, and where you live, and that's really so we can count, so that we can show RCAP and EPA, who, you know, sponsor our program, that we're actually reaching folks all over the country, and we are. We had over 6,000 people take our class already, and through these webinars, we've reached another 15,000 or so. So it's really useful material. It's been vetted by a lot of folks, and you know, if you haven't taken it, I encourage you to do so. So along with that, on the up here at the top, there's Home, Enrolling Class, Webinars, Events, and Resource Library. If you scroll over Resource Library, you can get to each of these 10 lessons. These are other materials that have been put out mostly by states or extension or universities on some of these topics that fit into each of these lessons, and they're so that you have more information rather than just the 6 or 8 pages that we've provided on some of these topics, so you can learn more about what an aquifer is and how groundwater moves and how it gets contaminated and all those sorts of things. And there's a set of these resources for every lesson. We've done a lot of webinars like today. This says 23 recordings. We're up in the high 30s now. This is an older slide, but we did a webinar on lead on August 16th last year, and there's also a lead page that goes along with that. So like if you're interested in lead, I know there's at least 1 or 2 questions. I'm just going to refer you to this webinar. You can watch it, and you know, it's got a lot of good information. Plus we've created this page that has resources from federal agencies and other groups on what you need to know about lead and drinking water and private water systems. So yeah, there's a lot of good information here, and that's our job, is to facilitate getting information to you all as a well owner if you want to learn. So we've got these short videos. How does my private well system work? How does my pressure tank work? Ironically, how does my pressure tank work is the most popular video we have. That tells us that a lot of folks have pressure problems with their systems, and also there's not a lot of good information out there about pressure tanks and how they work. I think it's had like 150,000 hits in a year and a half or almost 2 years now. So, you know, what can I do if my well goes dry? What do I do after a flood or a fire? These are 4 to 6 minutes long. They're about one topic, and they're meant just to give you some common advice and things you can do moving forward to try to deal with that situation. We've developed some podcasts. We only have the first 3 lessons so far. That's 1, 2, and 3 on this list. The other 3 are all radio interviews that we've done with State Farm Bureau, RFD, Illinois, on different issues related to private wells. And these are fairly popular. I think we've had about 2,200 downloads. And it's just another way to learn if you're into that, or, you know, people who drive every day and things like that, like podcasts. So we've tried to make it convenient for everybody. And in the end, the goal of our program is to help people understand why their well is important, why they need to understand how it works, so that they can help protect themselves from risk. And, you know, you're on your own, and so you need to be diligent and informed and educate yourself about your well so that you're doing the right things to protect you and your family. So that's what we're trying to do. So with that, that's the last slide, but I'm going to pull over from my other screen a list of questions. I need to make this full screen and enlarge it a little bit, if I can. There we go. And so, so going back to the algae question here, again, I need to get more information because I can't find a lot of good information that suggests you'd ever find algae in a well. And as I said, the only time we've seen it is, algae needs sunlight to live. So it shouldn't exist in groundwater, is the bottom line. And I've never, as a groundwater hydrologist who's worked for 30 years in this field, I've never had algae be an issue. So if it's in your well, and this second part of your question here today kind of leads me to think that we're not talking about a traditional well. You wouldn't have fish or anything else in your well. They excrete bacteria, and we're trying to keep those things out of your well. So there is no organism that you want to have in a well that you're using for your drinking water, period. And so it's not an option. I don't know. What I would appreciate is if you want to talk further, send us an email and I'll give you a call and we can talk about your situation, because I'm not really sure what's going on with this situation is the bottom line. And I'm sorry I don't have a better answer. But moving on, because we're past time. Dan, you want to answer this? I'm pretty sure I said I must have been talking fast, and I said GAC filter, probably, or GA filter.
Sure, I can try.
So what's a GAC filter? I think the question.
GAC stands for granular activated carbon. I've typically seen them used for removal of tastes and odors and organic compounds. I think they're typically like a point of use filter. But I think the EPA was using them to also help get rid of lead, like in Flint. Is that right, Steve? Have they used? Yeah.
There are certain types that work well in lead.
I'm not overly familiar with the various types, but GAC stands for granular activated carbon, and you could certainly read more about that. In the sake of time, I think that's all I'll say.
Sure. So the next question, and I know there was a question that I didn't include about shipping a sample to the USA from another country. I have no idea the best way to do that. I would assume it'd be with a courier service like a UPS or something like that. But you'd have to work that out with whoever your recipient is, if it's a lab, if they'd even do that. Your best bet is to find a place closer, and that may not be possible. But unless, I think it would be really expensive to ship a sample and get it there in an amount of time. But again, you need to talk to the lab where you'd be sending this sample to find out, what kind of time frame they'd want the sample in, and then see if it's even possible. So, it's not something we've dealt with, and our lab doesn't do samples outside of Illinois, and so it's not something we would be involved in. So, and I apologize for not having a better answer for you there, but you're really on a fact-finding mission, I think, if you're going to try to do something like that. We don't have an answer. So, number 4, how reliable is shot chlorination for our well water? Well, it works. It kills bacteria, right? It's chlorine. So where it fails is when it's not done right, where they're not following the right procedure, where you're not mixing it well, or where there's a continual source. So you could have a shallow well that either has a hole in it, or the joint has somehow gone bad or rusted if it's a steel well, or there's preferential flow in the shallow clay even that allows flow into your well from nearby, and it's a septic system or a livestock situation. No matter how many times you shot chlorinate it, you're going to keep getting more bacteria because water is constantly moving into your well as you use water. So the actual process itself works really well, but there's situations where it's not appropriate to just shot chlorinate your well because you're going to continue to get contamination, or you have a hole in your well. I mentioned the tree root. Those people chlorinated their well several times, and they were really frustrated that they have no livestock, not near the septic at all. What's going on? And it turned out a tree root had cracked their casing, and tree roots have a lot of bacteria associated with them, and it was causing bacteria to get in their well, and it'll just keep happening unless they get rid of the tree root or put in a different well. So it's a pretty good process. It's tried and true. It's simple. That's about all I can say there. Can you neutralize chlorine and or bleach in well water to make it safe to drink? And Dan, I'm going to let you answer this because I'm assuming by safe to drink they mean that chlorine can be a health risk in some cases. I know there's, trihalomethanes and some other things that are disinfection byproducts. I don't think you're going to see that, but what would you do to neutralize bleach in well water?
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
I don't have a perfect answer, to be honest, right now. In the laboratory, we've used sodium thiosulfate. I have no idea, though, if that would ever be recommended to be used in a well system. I hesitated to even mention it here. I'd have to read a little bit more about it. I think the safer thing, instead of adding something else, then the thing about chlorine is that you can smell it. So when you're disinfecting your well, you want to make sure you have a little chlorine residual. That makes it easy to tell if you've got enough in there. But if you're going to add something that neutralizes it, unless you know that thing itself is also safe, you're going to have to flush that out too. I think the best answer here is just to use several flushings. Maybe, I don't know what the common recommendation is, but I think the easiest thing is to flush it until you don't smell the chlorine anymore. You might see some recommendations that will say, like, flush 1 or 2 well volumes out, but just keep the water running. If the question has to do with formation of some of the chlorinated disinfection byproducts, the flushing should get rid of that too.
Yeah, and see the way this question's worded makes it seem like there's always going to be chlorine in their well water, which to me sounds like they have a continuous chlorinator
I see.
Something like that. And if that's the case, then it would probably be worth having your water tested to see if you have any of those disinfection byproducts coming out of your tap, because in all likelihood you don't. It doesn't happen always, I don't believe. But otherwise, a community water supply is required to have a chlorine residual throughout their distribution system all the way to the end. And so the water for community water supplies always has a little chlorine in it. You're not taking it all out.
I think the carbon filters will take, if you really wanted to get rid of it, I think if you had a carbon filter afterwards, it would take care of that.
The GAC will remove that.
But you'd have to keep maintaining it too, and if they're not maintained, I think they get a reputation for even being a breeding ground for bacteria.
Right.
I suppose it wouldn't be if you had a continuous chlorine coming in, but I'd be careful about it. Sorry, I misinterpreted the question initially.
Oh, no, I'm not sure. That's just my take. So we answered both that way, and that's probably good. All right, well, that's all we have today. I'm sorry to keep everybody along. I certainly appreciate your time and participating. And if you have any other questions, you can email us. There's the email address, info@privatewellclass.org. And again, this is recorded, so it should be up on our website in a week or so. So anyway, thanks for your time, and everyone have a great holiday.